everyone, I'm Tara. Welcome to Time Out with Tinseltown Mom. Today I'm going to be speaking with Lisa Novick Goldberg, author of The Apple and the Shady Tree, The Mafia, My Family and Me. Lisa takes readers into the corrupt, chaotic, and sometimes glamorous world of organized crime and reveals how her father's closest friends and business associates, the Mafia, wreaked havoc on her family as a child and her mental health as an adult. Today, Lisa will talk about her upbringing, plus share how she ensured her daughter didn't grow up with the same dysfunction that she had. Hi, Lisa. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Tara. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. So let's start by just getting to know you a little bit better. Can you give us a little insight into who you are and your family?
Yes. I'm 61 years old. I live in Coconut Grove, Miami, Florida. I grew up in the 5 towns of Long Island. I raised my daughter in Westchester County of New York. And I have a totally different life now than I did growing up.
Yes.
A lot of improvements there, yes.
Yes, I can imagine. So speaking of your childhood, as in the intro, we mentioned a little bit about your family having connections to the Mafia, which I'm sure there's a lot that comes out of that. Can you just talk a little bit about how you grew up and how your dad, who had very close ties to the Mafia, how that all started?
I go into it in detail in the book. I was born in Brooklyn. Both of my parents never even graduated high school. My father was particularly disadvantaged. He was poor, very poor. He grew up in Brownsville, which is still a tough area in Brooklyn today. And really the only way out for him, because he didn't have any formal education, or no chance to get it, was through his contacts in the neighborhood. And because of his background, being that he was a handsome guy, a very rugged guy, he was very, very smart, he was athletic, and he was a very loyal friend. And he got a reputation in the neighborhood, so he was introduced to a lot of the Italians that shared the neighboring neighborhoods. And ultimately, that led him to introductions down at the docks of Brooklyn and New York, which were home to the longshoremen, who were predominantly Italian. And Herbert Novick morphed into Johnny Novick, Big John Novick, and through Albert, the infamous Albert Anastasia, who was a big, notorious gang member in the Italian mob, my father was introduced to various mob members, and that started his associations with high-level mafia figures.
Okay. And then your mother, when she met your dad, was he already involved with these various crime families? Or how did her participation happen?
My mother got married when she was 17 years old, not to my father, to another man much older than her, because she had family issues as well as my father, and she wanted to get out of the house. So that marriage didn't last more than a year, and she was sick with an ovarian cyst and did not get along with her parents. And she met my father in a bar in the late 1950s, and I think they kind of saw in one another that they were kindred spirits. They were both different. They were both not one to accept any kind of formalities, what society was accepting in those days. So he said that he would take care of her, and she needed somebody to take care of her, and they moved in together very quickly. He moved into her apartment, and it was a dysfunctional relationship from just about day one.
Right.
And she had a sense very, very early on that he was not a regular worker. He would leave at 6 o'clock at night and come home at 8 o'clock in the morning. And his friends had weird names, Tuffy and Lucky and Tony Lunch and all these types of names. So she figured it out pretty quickly that she was not marrying a regular a working guy.
Right. Now, when she figured this out, that, he had ties to the mafia and a major organized crime family, the Genovese, is that how you say it?
That's
Genovese?
Genevieve. Yeah. Hmm.
Now, what, like, immediately, like, when she figured this out, did she just kind of assimilate to this lifestyle, or was that a hard shift for her?
No, it wasn't a hardship for her because he didn't bring it home. It's not like he would come home and sit down. In those days, he was a low level associate. So he was running crap games and stuff like that. There was nothing, they were all low level at that time, the people that were his age. He was very young. He was 25, 26 years old. So they have to work themselves up the ladder. So I've learned. Um, but she was a beautiful woman. My mother has been compared to a Sophia Loren look-alike. She was absolutely gorgeous, and she had severe issues, mental issues at the time. I mean, now looking back, she was never formally diagnosed, but she probably is borderline personality disorder. So she was not going to marry a typical Jewish guy who wouldn't have worked with her issues. So they really found one another.
Wow. Now, are they still alive today?
My father died 10 years ago in 2010. My mother will be 87 next week. She's in an assisted living facility down in Kendall, Florida.
Okay. Now, just going back to your childhood, because, your childhood was very unique, unlike many other childhoods. Well,
Yes, I was very much aware of that.
yes. But as a child, did you think, the way you grew up was normal, or did you think there was a different normal that you weren't privy to? Like, what was that like for you just growing up in that household?
It's interesting. That's a good question because nobody has asked me that. And I think I have an answer pretty quickly for that. I knew we were different, and I didn't know this was my life. I loved my parents. It was a kind of a love-hate relationship. I didn't know um, just to the extent how different we were. I knew when we entered into a restaurant, we were treated specially. I knew my father's friends were different than my friends' parents' friends. I grew up in a neighborhood, we moved from Crown Heights, Brooklyn in 1965. We moved to the 5 towns of Long Island, which were 99.9% Jewish. So all my friends that I grew up with were Jewish. But my parents' friends were not. They were not doctors and lawyers. They were what I know now as an adult. They were mob men. They were the friends of my father, like you see on The Soprano, with funny names and funny businesses. And that's who I grew up with. So I knew very early on with my friends that my parents were not like them. They did not play mahjong. They did not play golf. We didn't have Sunday afternoon football parties where we donned, the sports teams T-shirts and had barbecued wings. Sports was a business for my father. He was a gambler. He was probably running the games, had sports betting. So it took on a very different, our house was nothing like my friend's house. Plus, on top of that, my parents' relationship, they were fighting all the time, the brutal arguing and fighting. So, yeah, I grew up with a lot of anxiety, sometimes depression, which is partially genetic and partially situational.
Right, right. Were you the only child, Lisa?
I have a sister. She's 5 years younger than me. Unfortunately, it's a very sad story. I haven't seen her in about 15 years. She's somewhere in the Boston area. And my mother has not seen her in 25 years. That she suffers from a lot of issues with mental illness. And she was not as fortunate as I turned out. Her situation didn't turn out like mine.
Yeah, yeah. I'm so sorry to hear that. Yeah, I know you mentioned mental illness in your family, and a lot of it was undiagnosed. Did you ever just personally see a therapist and get diagnosed with anything specific?
Absolutely. I wanted to see a therapist. I can remember as far back as when I was 9, 10 years old, asking my parents that I needed help because I was suffering from severe anxiety. My mother said, absolutely not. Therapists hook you in, and then you'll be a lifetime patient of a therapist. They make the situation worse, which even as a child, I knew that sounded ridiculous to me.
Yeah.
In those days, there wasn't medication. There was no Prozac. There was nothing like that. So I toughed it out. And it was really tough. I can remember being a child, being so anxious, that it took all kinds of physical manifestations, stomach aches and trips to the school nurse and headaches and all kinds of things. But once I became an adult and I could make my own decisions, I sought out professional help immediately. But it was mostly on a situational basis. It wasn't until 5 years ago that I committed to psychoanalysis, and it's been tremendously helpful, plus medication.
Okay. And what was your diagnosis, if you don't mind sharing?
Anxiety sprinkled with depression, but mostly it's anxiety.
Okay. Okay. Now, even though your parents, they kind of put you in this situation as a child, and this is the environment that you grew up in, do you think they still try to protect or shelter you in any way whatsoever? Like, did you ever feel that?
Yes, absolutely, but it was not a healthy protection. Looking back and going through therapy and writing the book and putting it all out there and align and seeing it in writing puts a very good perspective on it. We were codependent. We were 4 people, my parents and my sibling and I, and we had a very destructive codependent dance, as these relationships are called. We were wrapped up in each other's neuroses. We clung to each other for dear life, but we weren't helpful to one another. It wasn't a helpful protection of one another. We came back because we didn't really have anybody else. We were intermeshed in all our problems. Me, particularly with my mom, though it did exist with my father. Codependency.
Right. And then your book, can you shed some light into the title first and then just tell us about the book?
Sure. The apple and the shady tree, it comes from the saying, the proverb, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. And that's a saying that both my parents used to use against me as a pawn in their battles. If my father didn't like my behavior towards him, he'd say to me really cruelly, the apple doesn't far fall from the tree, you're just like your mother. And my mother would say, you're just like him, Lisa. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree. So the apple and the shady tree, of course, the word shady is a double entendre for his relationships with the mafia. And the book, I beg the reader to come to their own conclusions. Did this apple fall far from the tree? Or am I deceiving myself that I have a lot more of my folks in me than I let on?
Yeah. Well, I look forward to reading it myself. So yeah, I understand. You don't want to give too much away, right?
Right,
For the book.
right. It's a very fun. There's a lot of funny scenes. My parents were characters. They're both of them complete, both very intelligent, but real characters. So there were a lot of very funny anecdotes in the book, and very sad moments as well.
Yeah. Now, was it hard for you to even come to terms with writing a book about your family and just exposing so much?
No, because I want to explain to you why I wrote the book. The book didn't happen it didn't come about as a project, a cathartic project or anything like that. I have been telling people when I moved down to Miami 7 years ago, they didn't know anything about me, the people that I was meeting. So I would tell them about my family, and of course the eyebrows would go up, and everybody would say, oh my God, you need to write a book, or this should be a screenplay or a Broadway play. And in 2015, my husband, who is a circuit court judge for the last 22 years, was diagnosed with cancer of the tonsil from the HPV virus. So I knew that my normally busy social life was going to come to a screeching halt. And I started to think about all these stories in my head, which were right there. These stories have lived with me for 60 some odd years. And I started to write them down. And as they got more developed, I would show them around to people. I'd write. I knew I could write well, though I have no formal education in that. And then it started to become a book. And as I would give out more and more pieces to show people, they liked it. And that's how the book came about. And it has not been a cathartic process. It just the opposite. It stirred up and excavated and stirred up tremendous anxiety in me. And that's where we are right now.
Yeah. How long did it take you to actually write from beginning to end?
It took me 4 years to write because I would go months without continuing it because I would meet with my therapist and I'd say, why am I doing this? And I really put myself out there. It is. And I put my family out there as well. So I had to think about the repercussions of something like that. So it took a long time to write. But ultimately, with the help of a therapist, it's a good book, and I'm very pleased that I did it, though I still, question my motives and stuff and what the repercussions are going to be for something like this, but I know I did the right thing.
Yes. Now, I don't know a lot about the mafia, very little. But
Why? You got a sheltered background, didn't
I know, exactly. Very sheltered. Um, Now, did you have to change the names of some of the characters in the book? I mean, what was that like?
No, I didn't do any of that.
Okay.
Everything that I didn't know any big mafia secrets, Caroline. I didn't, if you're looking for big mafia secrets, this is not the book for you. I gave you the mafia people that I knew, the ones that helped to tip me over in terms of my anxiety and the depression. I wound up in front of a grand jury in 1988, and that really was a tipping point for me because it made me realize the extent of my father's involvement in the mafia, and it created a whole new source of anxiety for me. Was I going to lose my father? Was he going to go to jail? Was I going to say something in the grand jury that was going to make him go to jail, or anybody else, any of his friends and people that I grew up with? So I didn't worry when I wrote the book that there was going to be any mafia retaliation. My father would have been 91 now, so his friends are either dead or dying in prison or whatever. I took my information from the internet. Everything is public record. I didn't want to ruin anybody's life. I didn't want to throw anybody under the bus. And then I add all my anecdotes and how it affected their actions, affected my life.
Right. And you actually had to testify against your father, right? Is that correct?
Well, I can't get into, you're not allowed to get into any of the workings of a grand jury.
Yeah.
But when I went in there, I thought I was going to testify against my father. And of course, the questions, they said, the lawyer had said to me before I went into the grand jury, oh, don't worry, you're going to be in there for about 20 minutes. I was there for over 2 hours, and I did not, as corny as it sounds, I did not emerge the same person. I went into a severe depression. I got into bed for a week, but I never recovered from that experience. It was terrifying. That was a real traumatic experience, and I suffer today from PTSD, which is not just from the grand jury, but from the culmination of really a whole lifetime of living in fear of what I couldn't put my finger on.
Yeah, that's traumatic. I mean, that's very traumatic. I'm so sorry. So just speaking of that trauma, can you think of maybe one of the scariest moments that you had to live through as a child? Is there any moment that comes to mind?
As a child, is as a child, it's when when the anxiety started to come full force. I must have been about 12 or 13, and it was really crippling anxiety. As I describe in my book, because my father didn't have a normal desk job, I worried about him all the time, and I couldn't see him in one place. It's sitting in an office. I pictured him out on the streets of New York in the early 1970s, which is where he was. And I used to say to him, just call me every day. Just call me in the afternoon and when I get back from school and let me know that you're okay, which is pretty bizarre for an 11 or 12-year-old person. But my father, rather than helping me that way and soothing me that way, would say, what are you talking about? I can't call you every day at a certain time. I'm in the streets. There were no cell phones then. What are you talking about? You know, he was not sympathetic. He was not empathetic. You have to grow up, Lisa. That was his message throughout my life. You know, he was trying to toughen me up all the time. I get where he's coming from his type of upbringing. But I'm still a child. I was a sensitive child. I was not a boy, I was a girl, and he just did not have the compassion, the empathy for my anxiety. It was something that I had to just magically get over rather than try and understand what his role might have been in causing that anxiety and possibly helping me to get over it.
Yeah, and you were literally trying to get over it on your own. Like no therapist could help you,
Nope.
Your parents couldn't help you, it was all on your own. You had a lot of weight on your shoulders at such a young age.
Yes, teachers couldn't help in those days, even though teachers knew that there was something wrong. But it was not like today where, you know, it was a totally different time in the late 60s and the early 70s.
Right.
So,
and then
by my own, yeah.
Yeah. And then fast forward, when did you meet your husband? Is this the husband that you're with now? Is this your first husband?
No, I gravitated towards lawyers because I thought on some psychological level that they would be able to protect me from the chaos in my life. My first husband I married in December of 1986, and he was a personal injury lawyer, and we had my only child together, my daughter Maggie, who's now going to be 30 in May. And 8 years ago, I met my current husband, who lived down in Miami. He's a celebrated, very well-known retired circuit court judge. And we got married, April will be 3 years. So on some deep level, I'm looking to be on the other side of the team.
Right.
Another team.
Yes,
yeah.
right.
Yep.
So your first husband, when you met him, did he know your family? I mean, I'm sure he knew about your family background as your relationship progressed.
Yeah, Terrell, you picked it up pretty quickly. There was nothing hidden. We didn't go around, Lisa's father must be in the mafia. Everybody used to know. Everybody did. He dressed a certain way. He talked with that typical Brooklyn accent, you know, a wise guy kind of accent. And depending upon how he felt, he had that demeanor. So there were no secrets. And once you met his friends and the characters, Sally Boxcars and, Joey Carpets, you knew you weren't talking about, Dr. Schwartz in the Five Towns. I had a very different background. Yeah,
right.
We went to Williamsburg, Virginia for our vacations, or down to Disney World. We did that once. Or Expo 67, as I write. We went to Las Vegas or anywhere where there was where my father could be on a junket.
Yeah.
So it was a different childhood upbringing, yeah.
Right. And then fast forward, you have your daughter. Now, when you had your daughter, where was your father in his, I guess, crime business?
He was at the 80s was the peak. From what I can see, what I can put together, that was the real height of everything. He was by then he must have been in his early 60s. He had made a mark for himself. He was known as a very big gambler in Atlantic City and Las Vegas. His best friend, Veniero Mangano, or Benny Eggs Mangano, was the acting head of the Genovese family in place of Vinny the Chin Gigante. You know, when you talk about these things, it sounds so funny. I'm like laughing inside. It's one thing when you write it; it's a whole other thing when you say these names.
Right.
So I think he was at the height of his career,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and then he wanted to be the kind of grandpa to my daughter Maggie that he wasn't as a father, and he tried very, very hard.
Oh, wow. Now, how did you try to protect her from this lifestyle? I'm sure that your motherly instinct must have kicked in, just, having gone through all the trauma that you went through
Right,
yourself.
right. Well, good question. It wasn't just the mafia lifestyle. It was the whole dysfunctional parenting that I had. I tried to be. We did. My ex and I got divorced when she was 2.5 years old. So I was basically a single mom. He wasn't very much involved in her life, but on a day-to-day basis, she lived with me. I do everything completely opposite about what was done to you. Listen, be mindful, be present, be compassionate, and I got a triple A rating from my daughter. But it
Oh,
was easy. Yeah, it
yeah.
wasn't. And she suffers also very much from anxiety and depression.
Oh, wow. Now, did you
Yep.
did you get her treated early, just knowing that you probably sensed that, as she was growing up?
I tried. I did. I worked with a therapist from the time her father left us. I worked so that I would continue to be the very best parent that I could in terms of making, wise decisions and issues that came up. She started to develop some issues when she was a teenager, and we did not get her the proper help, and it kind of spiraled when she got to college down at the University of Miami. But she is strong, and she got her own help, and she continues to get help, and with the help of medication, she is unbelievable. She is a real, we call her Xena. When she was little, we used to call her Xena, the warrior, the princess warrior. She is a tough cookie. She is smart and compassionate, and she's the daughter that I hoped for.
That's so excellent. That's so beautifully said. Well, Lisa, thank you so much for sharing your story. I'm really looking forward to reading your book.
Please
Um,
do, and let me know what you think.
yes, absolutely. Now, if people want to find out more about you, where should they go?
I have a website, Lisa Novick Goldberg, and they can buy my book on Amazon in paperback or in Kindle, and an audiobook will eventually be coming. And I hope you'll be seeing more of me in different media venues. So I thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to Time Out with Tinseltown Mom. If you liked what you heard today, please be so kind and rate, review, and subscribe on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. Until next time.